Thank you, Mr Assistant President. I rise to speak in support of the Crimes Amendment Prohibition Display of Nazi Symbols Bill 2022. And I'd like to acknowledge the previous speakers, particularly the last two, in sharing their lived experience of their families with us tonight. That's very moving. My starting point, like all others in this place, is to place on the public record, of course, my total, deep, absolute abhorrence of all things that Nazism and fascism have represented in our society and the tragedy of the 20th century, with the evil of the Holocaust and the destruction of Europe, through the contemporary re-emergence of the scourge of Nazism and fascism that this bill is actually designed to address. When discussion amongst community members, including the Jewish community, started advocacy for legislation to ban the use of Nazi symbols, I pose a simple question. It is 2023, nearly 80 years since the end of the Second World War and the total defeat and collapse of Nazism. My grandfather fought in the war, although he fought the Japanese, and I wondered why in the intervening 78 years, his generation, nor indeed my parents' generation of baby boomers, had not moved in Australia to ban Nazi symbols, as they had done in other countries. I wanted to investigate that question. Why the urgent need to do it now, 3 generations after Nazism was wiped from the global political landscape? I found the answer to that question as I sat on as a member of the Standing Committee on Social Issues, which was tasked by this House to inquire into the initial private members' bill presented to the House by the Honourable Walt Secord. That inquiry heard evidence from the Australian Association of Jewish Holocaust Survivors and Descendants Incorporated, the Australian Jewish Association, the Australian Israel Jewish Affairs Council, the Anti-Discrimination New South Wales and the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies and the Hindu Council of Australia and the New South Wales Association of Jewish Service and Ex-Servicemen and Women, amongst others. These organisations have a proud history of standing up to anti-Semitism and discrimination in our state, and I commend them for their evidence to the inquiry and their essential work and vigilance in this space to make New South Wales a more tolerant and safe state for our citizens, regardless of faith or background. To better inform my contribution to the inquiry discussions, my party room discussions, which were quite robust on this issue as well, and indeed this debate tonight, last year I requested the Parliamentary Research Library to prepare a paper on the banning of Nazi symbols in jurisdictions worldwide. I'd like to commend the Parliamentary Library for the research paper they produced. It was excellent. The paper made clear that in taking this action, New South Wales is joining with countries that were torn apart by the scourge of anti-Semitism and the Nazi doctrine: Germany, Austria, France, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Serbia, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Lithuania and Latvia have all adopted legislation prohibiting the display of Nazi symbols, but in most cases decades ago. The paper also examined contemporary jurisdictions, including those mentioned earlier in Australia, tackling this issue, but especially I was interested in the various states of the United States trying to tackle this within the context of their Bill of Rights. Perhaps these countries moved earlier because the dark period of history associated with Nazism is more immediate and affected their collective consciousness. And as a nation, Australia, we were fortunate to avoid the direct horrors of occupation by the Nazi regimes. This is not to say in any way diminish the experience of so many Australians during the war and the many immigrants who made Australia their safe home over the coming decades after the war. 80 years ago, there was comparatively few Australians directly scarred by the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. But over the intervening years, many people and their ancestors immigrated to Australia, enriching our country, especially to escape the horrors of the war. And for those New South Wales residents and Australians, these symbols continue to evoke traumatic experiences, collective memories, and we heard that from other speakers tonight in regards to evidence. Australia has a necessary implied right to freedom of political communication in our Constitution. This is a fundamental part of our democracy. The Honourable Luamato referred to that in his contribution, and ensures that we can have informed and respectful debates around issues of importance. But this freedom ceases when it crosses the line to advocating hate and violence in our community, and these symbols that we're banning tonight fall into that dark category. At its core, the ideology these symbols represent says to a person, because of your faith, because of your ethnicity, because of your cultural background, because of your disability, because of your sexuality, you are a lesser human. This is a thoroughly repugnant idea, rejected by us all. The endorsement of this ideology through the active display of these evil symbols is an endorsement of the horrific crimes committed in their name. It's saying to those people who suffered, or their descendants, your suffering is actually validated. All members of the inquiry, the Social Issues Inquiry into the Crimes Amendment Bill, were supportive of legislation to prohibit the display of Nazi symbols in New South Wales. As was mentioned earlier, the Honourable Don Hohen chaired the inquiry and did a very, very good job in producing a report that we all supported. It's important that this legislation that we have tonight applies to everyone in New South Wales. No one has an exemption to promote hateful ideas. But it's also important that those who are displaying these symbols for legitimate public interest purposes reasonably and in good faith be allowed to do so, and be allowed to do so without requiring to jump through impractical hoops or do something reasonable and in good faith. Now, Mr. Deputy President, returning to the question I posed earlier in my contribution, in the Social Issues Inquiry we took evidence from many experts, but some of the most informative and compelling evidence for me was from the Police Deputy Commissioner David Hudson, the Deputy Commissioner for Investigations and Counter-Terrorism. He informed the committee in sworn evidence, and I'll just read two excerpts, and being asked about the need for this legislation. He said, "At the moment, it is not an offence to possess those materials, so we would put a suggestion through that they be considered on a very broad range, and any material that we did seize or detect through our investigation has some nexus to some violent offence." And he continued, "I think the intent for us is to try to restrict its use." This is the Nazi symbols. "Our responsibility would be to create the nexus between the symbol itself and the intended behaviour. That would be our responsibility to do that. If that behaviour and nexus could be proven, then in our view, an offence will be justified." Deputy Commissioner Hudson, in effect, was saying to us that this legislation will provide a tool for prosecution for those spreading hate. He confirmed to the inquiry that right-wing extremism was alarmingly on the rise in our society. Evidence of this was in the many attacks on the vulnerable communities, especially the Jewish community in our society today. These acts were nearly always associated with displays of Nazi or Nazi-derived symbols. The nexus of this display and the intention to prosecute violence needs to be understood and recognised by legislation to assist in the prosecution and the repression of this terrorism in our society. This legislation provides an important resource for the police to identify and prosecute the dangerous neo-Nazi right-wing terrorist criminal culture emerging across the Western world and in our state, and especially in the online environment. The inquiry, and especially the evidence, answered the question I posed at the beginning of the contribution. If not in the past 80 years, why do we have to do it now? As the lived experience of the evil of Nazism fades into the history books, the real danger is the attraction of this ideology as it's rising again from the embers of the Second World War. Its appeal again to the weak, the disaffected, the vulnerable, and indeed simply the evil, is a serious threat to our society and our vulnerable communities. We need this important legislation to reinforce the now distant memories of the great evils of the past and to make it clear that the re-emergence of Nazism and associated ideologies will be resisted by our liberal democracy as vigorously today as we did 3 generations ago on the battlefields of Europe. I commend this bill to the House.
Thank you.